International Reports. Around the World with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation.
Hello and welcome to another edition of International Reports. I'm Eric Olander. Today we're going to focus on maritime infrastructure. Now I know this isn't a particularly sexy topic, but I think you're going to find our focus on security issues very interesting. A lot of people think that when they're online or talking to somebody on the phone, those signals pass over landlines or bounce up to a satellite in space. While that is certainly true and it does happen, it only accounts for a tiny share of the world's data traffic. An astonishing 97% of the world's communication instead passes through enormous cables that are strung along the bottom of the ocean. Today, there's more than 1.3 million kilometers of undersea fiber optic cables that could literally stretch to the moon and back again. Now, this isn't a new phenomenon. The idea has been around for a long time, dating back all the way to 1850, when an undersea telegraph cable was laid across the English Channel from Dover to Calais in France. But so long as there have been those cables, there's also been concerns that they present a major security threat. And this issue has come up a lot lately, especially in Europe, where in the Baltics, at least 11 cables have been damaged in just the past couple of years. 2 were hit last November, and it's not just happening in Europe. At the same time, things are also happening in Asia where cables are being cut and attacked, some intentionally, some not. And if assailants are going after data cables, other infrastructure like undersea oil pipelines are also vulnerable, as we saw in the Nord Stream 2 explosions in 2022 that disabled the massive gas pipeline between Germany and Russia. Well, let's get a perspective on all this from Ferdinand Gehringer, who's a policy advisor on homeland and cybersecurity issues, and also wrote a fascinating report with Matthias Hespe on how to make Europe's maritime critical infrastructure more resilient. We have the link to that report in the show notes, and I want to welcome Ferdinand to International Reports. A very good afternoon to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Eric. Good to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Well, it's wonderful to have you. Let's get started kind of at the basics here, because you talk about maritime infrastructure, but it's kind of hard to define what that is. I talked about undersea cables and pipelines. What else is there when we talk about maritime infrastructure?
When we talk about maritime infrastructure, we especially focus on maritime critical infrastructure, including offshore wind farms, platforms, undersea data cable, undersea electricity cable. So this is basically the undersea infrastructure. But when we are talking about maritime critical infrastructure, we also include ports, harbors, and all the area around the harbor, including the digital sphere and the digital infrastructure of the harbors and ports, for instance. So when we talk about maritime critical infrastructure, it's the infrastructure very close to the maritime sphere, very related to maritime dimension.
Yeah, and we talk about the vulnerabilities, though, and that's what you focus on in terms of security. We've had this question of Nord Stream and these broken cables. What are some of the other vulnerabilities that stretch across the maritime infrastructure sector that you're focusing on in this report?
We could observe in the last months and years, to be honest, especially in the Baltics, a lot of incidences. So especially the Baltic area is in a hybrid conflict with Russia. We could observe, for instance, this interruption of undersea data cable, of undersea electricity cable. You already mentioned at the beginning, we had the Nord Stream pipelines incident years ago, where both pipelines got more or less interrupted, and now the project of Nord Stream 2 is not really running and cannot be used, that the pipeline cannot be used again. But we also have kind of incidences on the maritime theater when it comes to the GPS jamming, so interrupting the signal of, for instance, airplanes. We had a lot of cyber attacks on ports. For instance, the Hamburg port got attacked. They got attacks every day, around 200 and 300,000 cyber attacks per day. We have disinformation campaigns when it comes to these incidents. So Media is reporting about incidents, and other media is trying to influence these campaigns and these informations with spreading disinformation and manipulated information. So we have a very fluent and hard to really identify a hybrid theater, especially in the Baltics. But if you have a closer look on Asia, we got a lot of interruptions of undersea data cable in the coast of Vietnam. So there is a lot going on, and it seems that some state and non-state actors are focusing more and more on our vulnerabilities when it comes to the maritime infrastructure.
When we think about the vulnerabilities, these are cables that stretch sometimes thousands of kilometers and they extend beyond national boundaries. They go into very desolate places in the middle of the ocean where nobody's there to look. You can't put cameras everywhere. How do countries manage this risk when, in fact, it stretches so far and is so remote, given the fact that these cables are oftentimes at the bottom of the ocean, or most of the time at the bottom of the ocean?
So there are basically two ways the protection of the undersea infrastructure is very hard. You already mentioned the depth, you already mentioned the length. It's not very easy to protect them. So they go for two other approaches. One of the approaches is the redundancy. So they build a lot of cables to get redundant connections between different regions, between different continents. And the other thing is to get a fast reparation circle. So you need repair ships which are repairing the cables. And we have about 200 and 300 incidents per year when we have to repair this infrastructure. And ask yourself, could you or have you explored an interruption in your internet connection so far? I think it's just a little cases worldwide when we really could notice that there were like an interruption in our connection, because we have a high level and a very good system of redundancy so far. But what happened in the last years is that a lot of actors are trying to manipulate the infrastructure. So there are some natural interruptions, some natural incidences when it comes to earthquakes, or we have some cases with the anchors of some ships. But when there are other actors trying to manipulate the infrastructure, then we got in trouble regarding our capacities for the reparation.
Now, we should be very clear. You mentioned this, that while there's a lot of concern about malign actors, and Russia and China often come up as frequent targets of that. But this infrastructure is also subject to the dangers of climate change and just earthquakes and natural disasters as well, both maritime and above shore as well. Talk about the risks that we have to deal with here, both human and natural.
I think we should have in mind that we are totally dependent from the infrastructure when it comes to the data cable infrastructure. As you already mentioned, we are shifting between 95, 99% our dependence of the undersea infrastructure data connectivity. There is no alternative so far. We are trying to implement or to invest more in satellites. The thing is, satellites are not a real alternative so far. They are too expensive. The connection is too risky. It's too slow so far. So when we are focusing on the risk, then there is the dependent of the infrastructure itself. There is the dependent of certain manufacturers of the infrastructure, most of them coming from the US, most of them coming from China. So when it comes to more geopolitical tensions and the question who is controlling the infrastructure, we, especially in Europe, we are not having our own infrastructure. Therefore, we need to invest in our own infrastructure to get our own redundancy, a lower level of dependency from these specific manufacturers. And on the other hand, also increase our repair capabilities, because we will have these natural disasters also in the future. We will have these earthquakes, and like the most common reason for an interruption is the fishing, are the anchors of ships. So having in mind that we need a flexible, agile, dynamic repair fleet internationally is very important to really reduce the duration of outages.
So you brought up an interesting point there that sometimes it's accidental, right? So a ship just puts down an anchor and by accident drags a cable and breaks it or something like that. Is that common?
I mean, we had a lot of cases with the Shadow Fleet. We are
Right, where they
expecting,
in the Shadow Fleet where they say it was accidental, but a lot of people doubt that it was,
yeah.
right?
So what we had in the last years is that there were accidents with ships and anchors. Okay, so most of the cases are accidents, but nowadays we could observe many other cases where, for instance, the Shadow Fleet or Russian research vessels, they used the argument that, oh, sorry, we didn't know that, we didn't know where your infrastructure is, it was an accident, we threw out our anchor for kilometers, for hundreds of kilometers in the open sea, and sorry, we didn't notice that this happened to your infrastructure, and we really didn't notice that our anchor was out there. I mean, we are not believing these kind of argumentation so far. So there are a lot of newer incidences where we are expecting a manipulation and not just accidents.
Now, we've brought up the Russians. Again, the Chinese often come up in this discussion as well. But is this type of attack on maritime infrastructure a little bit like espionage, where every country does it because it's a part of statecraft, even though some countries are singled out more often than others? Do Europeans, the Americans, the Japanese, and others engage in this type of what you call hybrid warfare as well? Or is it something that we should really think about in the context of certain countries?
So far, I would say it's really just an issue for certain countries, because like Russia is really they are not just like having these kind of accidents in a way, they are also monitoring the whole maritime domain when it comes to where is the infrastructure, where are the most vulnerable points, where are the choke points of the infrastructure, to try to manipulate them. For us in Germany and also in the European Union, it's kind of a new topic to think about another level of protection of the infrastructure. We were used to use the infrastructure. We were used to repair the infrastructure because of these natural or accidental incidents. And nowadays, we have to face also the fact that there are some actors so far which are trying to manipulate, to really fulfill kind of sabotage, not only espionage when it comes to checking the data. I mean, espionage is another question. Espionage could be checking the data connection. So when it comes to controlling or checking the data on certain points, I mean, this is a question of other countries as well. I mean, the US or UK, they do a lot of espionage when it comes to these undersea data infrastructure. But espionage, in a way, tracking and mapping the whole seabed to prepare kind of different attacks on other critical infrastructure. This is kind of a new thing, and this is very special to certain countries which are using these kind of tactics for their hybrid warfare.
So you spend a lot of time at conferences and with policymakers and various stakeholders in Europe, and you talk about these issues. You've also just mentioned that this is a relatively new phenomenon, the way that these attacks are being undertaken, even though undersea cables have been around for a long time and security issues have been around for a long time. But today it's a little bit different. And when you talk with these people about these challenges, do you get the sense that they understand what's at stake and the seriousness of the issue? Or do they just say, you know, Ferdinand, yep, we hear you, and then they move on to something else?
I think it's both ways. So the first thing, and it's on a very positive note, that there is going on a lot out there. So we're trying to really build up communities when it comes to the protection of the critical infrastructure. But the thing is, it's a very broad topic. You have a lot of stakeholders in there, not just only the state interests or regional interests or interests from the European Union. You also have different providers, different users from all over the world, different countries, and to have to bring up to bring together. You have to bring together all the different stakeholders on one table to really find out what is my role in protecting and building up the resilience of the critical infrastructure. What can I do in increase the level of resilience when it comes to the infrastructure? And this takes time, to be honest. This takes a lot of time. And then you have the issue of, do we have the right burden sharing between the state and the private sector? The private sector is running the infrastructure, but also all the state services, the public services are depending. I mean, imagine our digitalized world. All the public services are more or less digitalized right now. We are using the infrastructure of the private sector. So we are right now in a debate, how can we really balance the burden sharing between state and private sector, and who should protect the infrastructure, who should invest in redundancy, who should invest, and how much should we invest into repair capabilities. And in an ideal world, internationally and not only in certain regions. But there, for sure, there are some regions or countries which are still not really affected by these discussions because they haven't had any incidents or they are not in the focus of these actors. For sure, there are arguing, as you as you argued at your second thought. They say, oh, okay, we have a lot of the infrastructure, we will invest in satellites, and somebody will help us out when it comes to an incident. But I mean, we had the cases of the Tonga Islands. They were cut off for days after an incident. And our digitalized society in Europe, in the US, in Southeast Asia, and Asia in general, we are really dependent of this digital infrastructure.
And given that dependence, one would assume that in the event that a major conflict breaks out, one between the United States and China, between Russia and Europe, and I mean, on that level, that within the first days of this conflict erupting, you would think that either one side or both sides would move quickly to try and cut the cables, given that, as you mentioned, we're so dependent. So this is a critical part of warfare now in the 21st century.
It definitely is a critical part of warfare in our modern century. We saw, for instance, in the Russian aggression against Ukraine, that they tried at the beginning to interrupt the communication of the Ukrainian soldiers. They made a cyber attack on Viasat. Viasat is a satellite provider, and they could manage to interrupt the communication of the soldiers at the front line of Ukraine to get this advantage. So this shows us that communication, even if it's a communication of satellites or the communication of the undersea data cable infrastructure, can play a crucial role. So it could be a part of a modern conflict scenario. The thing is, states are also preparing on a national level to build up other redundancies. So we're gonna have some satellite networks which are providing satellite connection when it comes to an interruption on an undersea data cable, for instance. But there are scenarios which includes, especially the case of Taiwan. They are also scenarios that China is trying to interrupt, first of all the data cable connectivity when it comes to possible conflict, to really get this advantage on the battlefield.
Now, you didn't only identify the problems, the challenges, and the risks. You and Matthias also made a number of recommendations. Now, you've already talked about a couple. You mentioned redundancy, and you mentioned quick repair facilities to be able, if there is a break, to be able to quickly respond to that. What are some of the other recommendations that you're giving to policymakers and other stakeholders in how to deal with this vulnerable maritime infrastructure?
We should also think about, when it comes to recommendations, policies, about adapting our international law. So when we built up the UNCLOS, we really weren't thinking about manipulation, sabotage of maritime critical infrastructure. And even I think we didn't know about our dependencies nowadays when it comes to the data infrastructure. So I would address in the international law more direct that the manipulation, espionage, and sabotage on maritime critical infrastructure is an act against international law, and it's not the responsibility of the flag state, which is right now, to really enforce the international law. It should be addressed on an international level, on the UN level, that we are trying to address the manipulation of infrastructure as an act of violence against the state or against the infrastructure itself. So we should adapt the international law. We should build up own redundancies. We should build up the repair capacities, which are right now on a level about 70 repair ships. They are very old, so we definitely need newer ones. We need kind of an association internationally which is organizing the repair fleets regional, and then you have like not and then it won't take you days for being in the region of the incident, so that you can repair very fast, and also try to integrate satellite systems and satellite communication into our whole data connectivity. So there is one project on a NATO level. It's called NATO Heist, where they try to use also satellite systems in one communication ecosystem. Once one of the digital cables, the data cables, the undersea data cables got interrupted, we could be able to reroute the connection via satellite, that there is just a small and maybe a short interruption, but in the end we can still use the connectivity. So there are some newer ideas also when it comes to monitoring the maritime domain, but I have to admit, just monitoring and trying to protect the maritime domain won't be the solution. But when it comes to deterring some of the state actors, also the monitoring, being present, so the idea of the idea of deterrence by presence. So we are present on the sea, we can see what is going on, we can react very fast. This is one other option to really prevent some incidents in some cases.
The report is Lifelines Under Threat: How We Could Make Europe's Maritime Critical Infrastructure More Resilient. Absolutely essential reading right now in this time, because it's a part of the security matrix that we don't focus enough attention on. And as Ferdinand mentioned, we are so dependent on this infrastructure for our daily lives that to not know about the threats and the solutions is really very, very important. It was written by Ferdinand Gehringer, who's a policy advisor on homeland and cybersecurity issues, and also his co-author, Matthias Hespe, a policy advisor on maritime security as well. So thank you for joining us today. And again, please pass on our gratitude to Matthias for the great work you guys did in that report. Really appreciate your time today.
I will. Thanks for the invitation, Eric. It was great fun and very interesting. Stay tuned.
And we want to thank you for joining us in International Reports. We'll be back every month with a new episode and fascinating interviews with people like Ferdinand. Until next time, thank you so much for listening.